Hello, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Daniel Castro, and I'm Director of the Center for Data Innovation. The Center is a think tank focused on the intersection of data technology and public policy. And today I'm delighted to kick off a new book talk series that we're going to be hosting. For our first session today, we're privileged to be joined by Professor Julia Lane, author of the book Democratizing Our Data, a Manifesto. Dr. Lane is a professor at the NYU Wagner Graduate School of Public Service, as well as the NYU Center for Urban Science and Progress. She co-founded the Coleridge Initiative, whose goal is to use data to transform the way governments access and use data for social good. Previous to this, she was a senior managing economist and an institute fellow at American Institutes for Research. In this role, she co-founded the Institute for Research on Innovation and Science at the University of Michigan. She's also held positions at the National Science Foundation, the Urban Institute, the World Bank, and others. Her book is really required reading for anyone interested in the future of government data in our country. She argues in the book that public data is crucial to a well-functioning democracy, but America's public data infrastructure is crumbling, and a renewed commitment to producing high-quality public data is necessary for data that can serve the public good. I think this is an incredibly timely and important conversation, a very important book that's coming at a time right now when many Americans are experiencing firsthand the importance of getting good data and how that impacts their lives and livelihoods. For everyone joining us today, this program is meant to be interactive, and your questions are welcome. You're invited to submit questions via Slido. If you are watching this on the center's website, you can find the link to Slido at the bottom of the page. If you're watching on YouTube, you can find the link to submit questions in the video description. So Julia, thank you so much again for spending some time with us today and sharing your thoughts about your book. I'll turn this over to you. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And it's so nice to reconnect and particularly you helped so much with getting Patents View up and started. So it's lovely to reconnect in the data world again. So let me kind of walk you through what we're going to be talking about. So I've been a faculty member for many years, so I'm going to start with telling you what the key ideas are, and then I'm going to unpack them, and then I'm going to tell you what I told you. So that's kind of the arc of what I'm going to do. So I've been involved with putting data together, national data infrastructures for most of my career. And I think because you guys have logged in and are listening to this, you care as much about data and the public data system as anyone does, and certainly I do. And I wrote the book essentially because I just think there are major challenges to the existing system. And in fact, it was stimulated by a lunch I had with one of the top statisticians in the country, and we were bemoaning all the problems that the federal statistical system had. And, you know, the person looked at me and said, you know, there are so many good people, and over the past 20, 30 years, nothing has changed. Nothing fundamental has changed, and we're going down the tubes, and what are we going to do about it? And so I think part of what I make the case for in the book is the importance of public data, the value that it has to the functioning of a democracy, and the challenges that we face. And part of it is the funding infrastructure, but also part of it is the difficulty, given the organizational systems that we face, for the system to innovate. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what that means. And then I'm going to say we've got a huge opportunity, massive opportunity. We've got technological change. We don't need to think about a centralized system. We could think about a network system where we can use new ways to collect and access and use data. There are new skills that we're going to have to develop, different from survey methodology. There's new data science and computer science skills. And the ability to build a community of practice that are going to enable us, rather than just have the data handed to us from on high, we ourselves can collaborate and replicate and reproduce and create new data infrastructures. That doesn't mean that we should get rid of the current system. There are massive and tremendous high quality statisticians and survey methodologists and so on who have an enormous investment in producing high quality statistics. But I think building a complementary system that enables us to rethink the way in which we organize public data, the way in which we train people to create it, and the way in which we generate the measures that are of interest, we should be rethinking that. We currently have a system that essentially came out of the Great Depression and the Second World War and the Cold War, and it really hasn't changed very much. And we are facing a massive crisis, and it's time to change the way in which we think about things. So Daniel was nice enough to introduce me. Just some background. I am an economist by training. I've worked in academia government consulting. I've built a lot of national data infrastructures. Many of you will be familiar with the LEHD program. I'm a New Zealander. I was responsible for the initial phases of the IDI, the Integrated Data Infrastructure. And I've worked for a bunch of federal and state and international agencies. So that's kind of the context from which I'm coming. So I kind of gave you a teaser about the lunch I had, but then when I started to think about what are we going to do if the system isn't changing, what's going to happen to the way in which we produce public data? And what I'm very worried about is that if we don't rethink how we're doing things, we are going to face an erosion of the quality of the decisions that are made. Obviously people are thinking about the census right now, and of course the classic line is, if you're not counted, you don't count. And I think that's a very important point. If you don't show up in statistics and data, you're not going to be able to have a voice. And that's kind of why I talk about democratizing our data. But from a very granular point of view, if we're trying to figure out where to put schools or where to put roads or where to put housing, or there are a million decisions that are being made in the public sector that, if you're rich in the private sector, you can pay for it. But if you're not, you're going to rely on the public system. So it's critical that we think about this. This is a quote from probably one of the greatest federal bureaucrats in the federal statistical system of all time, Janet Norwood, who was Commissioner of the Bureau of Labor Statistics. She wrote that in 1995. And I actually, after the lunch, I went and got a copy of her book, Organizing to Count, in which she laments the challenges. And when I was reading the book, it was like, my God, it could have been written now, 25 years later. And she's got this quote in here where there is a criticism in the president's budget, back in President Clinton's budget, which says the current data gathering system, so this is a 25-year-old data gathering system, the resulting product goes underutilized in a world in which timely and accurate information is often key to competitive business success. So if you think about it, that's really the organizational structure of the book. So I kind of say, why should we care? I learned very early on, why does this matter? And then I describe the way in which data are currently collected, and then talk a bit about what the sources of failure are. And then what I talk about is, the reason I told you a bit about my background, is there are successful models upon which I think we can draw. And just to foreshadow those a little bit, I think the model of the national labs, thinking about we're in a time of a jobs crisis, an economic crisis, and a measurement crisis, and thinking about a Manhattan Project-like approach to that is a parallel activity the federal system and complementary, that brings together both the new technical capacities and also the training capacities of something like the agricultural extension system. So I'm going to talk about that as, yeah, we've got a big problem, but I think we've got pathways to address those problems. So that's how the book's structured. And here's where I think we have a massive opportunity. I hope I've made the case, and I believe that the reason you're dialing in is that you also think that public data are important. And I think clearly in the private sector, the big companies are the ones that have harnessed data. So if you think about the four big companies, Amazon, Apple, Facebook, and Google, and of course Microsoft, which is the one, they're massive companies in the United States and the world. And partly the reason that they've done that is they've figured out how to harness data. In academia, National Science Foundation as one of its big challenges, harnessing the data revolution. So why is it that in academia and the private sector, everyone's able and generating rich ideas and rich resources by harnessing data, and yet in the federal government, the public data agencies are under funding stress and under huge amounts of criticism. And I'm going to argue that part of the problem here is a failure to innovate and a failure to produce products that have value to the constituencies that they should be serving. And it's not that people are stupid and say, oh, we don't want public data. They do. We need some innovation in the way in which that public data is produced and provided. And I'm an economist, so I'm not just going to assert that those are important. I say, what's the market telling us is important? And if you take a look at what data scientists make, they make a lot of money. And so the market is signaling, at least in the private sector, that these skills and this has value. So what's stopping us? What's stopping the private sector? And I wish we were in person, but I just want to make the point that there's been this big concern, for example, about the production of COVID data. And if I could see you and ask you to put up your hands, I would ask, how many of you, when you are trying to figure out the death rate or the local data on COVID, I'd ask you how many people go to the CDC site, and very few people would be putting up their hands. They go to Johns Hopkins or Wildermeter or 1.3 Acres and other sites like that. So they're going to private sector or academic efforts, not to the government. And the challenge that we're facing is the organizational structure, the way in which the federal statistical system is essentially set up to fail. The office that handles the federal system is in OMB, it's in OIRA, it's many layers down. It has staff fewer than 10 to manage the system, and it's relatively fragmented. There are 13 agencies, obvious major statistical agencies. There's one obviously 800-pound gorilla, which is the Census Bureau, but the organizational structure is set up to fail. Now, in Janet Norwood's book, she argued strongly for more centralization. I argued the opposite, which is much more decentralization, in order that ideas can come up from the people who are closer to the coalface of social and economic activity. I'll give you an example of that in just a minute. Obviously, the funding structure is a challenge. It's a challenge with any bureaucracy, because essentially you get funded to do the same thing, and there's no room for innovation and new ideas. You're funded to produce something, and you're going to keep going ahead and producing it because that's the every quarter you have to produce a number, or every month you have to produce a number. So there's not a lot of room for experimentation and change. And the salary structure is obviously another challenge. So the results that we are stuck with is the questions that are asked are the same questions that have been asked for years and years and years and years, which is great from the point of view of longitudinal consistency, but it may not be great from the point of view of being able to answer questions that the taxpayer or the user community is particularly interested in. It also means that the way in which we collect data with the federal statistical system is still heavily driven by surveys, and the innovations that are possible from the new types of data, people know that they're out there. Everyone's smart and hardworking and all that kind of stuff. There's been 1 million National Academy studies and COPAF studies and so on, but it's very difficult to implement because you're on the same trail. And then the other reason is, the other problem that you run into is lack of innovation. So in the federal government, if you try and do something and you fail, it can be a career ender. In the private sector, you just pick yourself up and you go and start another company. So that's why we end up with a CDC site that people don't go to. We have unemployment measures. And I'm going to bang on about this, and it's a little bit unfair, but it makes the point, I think. We're in the situation where we have the biggest jobs crisis since the Great Depression. And yet, really what we need is information about who is unemployed at local levels, what are their characteristics. We need to get that in the hands of people who can provide training or provide job search assistance and so on. We have workforce boards who are able to do that. And yet the data that are available from the federal government are not the data that can be put into their hands for actionable evidence. The unemployment rate number that is described here is based on a survey of 60,000 households. And the question that is asked is, were you actively looking for work during the survey week? That's the number that makes the headlines. There are actually 6 different measures, but that's the number that is generated. That's not actionable from the point of view of people who are out of work. How long have they been? You want to have a sample size that is big enough to be able to provide quite detailed information. How close are they to benefit exhaustion? What on earth is possible? I'm not going to belabor it anymore, but those data exist. They exist through administrative records in states, and they can be harnessed and deployed at scale very quickly. So you can get the data on a Monday about all the unemployed people who are on unemployment benefits, the entire sets of cohorts. You can figure out their wage replacement rates, how close they are to exhaustion, and how close they are to being reemployed, and get that data into the hands of the workforce boards within 3 days. So you don't have to wait a month to get the information, and you don't have a kind of abstract concept. You have a very real and actionable approach. And so rethinking what we're measuring and how we're measuring it is the innovations that I would like to see that could help us address the what's going on in the economy. So how are we going to get there? Well, one of the ways in which we can think about it is the way in which GDP came to play. This is a great book, and I talk about it a little bit in my book. So in the 1930s, there wasn't any data that Herbert Hoover could use to figure out how much the economy was tanking. He was using freight loadings on trains. And so what the Commerce Department did at the time was they reached out to the NBR and they brought in Simon Kuznets and a small team of researchers to figure out how could we measure what was happening to economic activity. And that was the originator of the GDP figure. So notice that the idea here is the innovation and the ideas came from outside. And I talk a bit about outsiders and insiders. And that was where the new approach came. So what I'm arguing here is we can rethink the way in which we generate unemployment numbers, in which we can measure economic and social activity, instead of using measures that worked or were developed 80 years ago or close to 100 years ago. We should rethink how we're capturing this information. And we've got the capacity to do that. The other thing that's stopping us is obviously privacy. That's a big deal for the federal statistical system, both for legal reasons and for ethical reasons. So the challenge that we've had is, whereas the private sector, they're trying to get better and better data to you, in the federal statistical system, they're trying to muck it up. So I talk about this in the book, spending $16 billion for the census and spending lots of time convincing people to fill out the forms as closely as possible. And then what they're doing is adding noise. And you can argue whether that's a good thing or not. That's the way in which they've chosen to protect confidentiality. But it's generated a lot of concern in the community. Part of it, there's a big debate going on as to whether those criticisms are fair or not. But the notion that that's the way to deal with privacy has generated a lot of criticism in the community. So what are we going to do about it? Well, part of what I argue is we can rethink the way in which we collect and store and protect data. So it used to be, and certainly when I built the LEHD program, we talked to the states and 6 federal agencies, and all the data went to the Census Bureau because that was the place that had the state-of-the-art protections and so on. And there was the security that none of the data, it was kind of the Hotel California of data. What has happened over the past 20 years since we built the LEHD is the cloud. And something actually that the Office of the Federal CIO supported, which is something called FedRAMP. So that's a secure, controlled, monitored, and approved environment in the cloud. And the FedRAMP system has like 440 security controls. The point here is states and agencies don't have to physically ship their data anywhere and then say goodbye, we can't see it anymore. They can put their data, and they have been putting their data in the cloud. So you've got a safe setting. And each agency controls its own house within that city walls. And they can put their data in, they can share it. And then for approved projects, so safe projects, they can approve the individuals and the data sets that can be shared, and they can monitor it. So all of a sudden, Kentucky and Tennessee and Illinois and Ohio and Indiana can look at what's happening to flows of workers and individuals across state lines because they can put it in the cloud and they can track access and use. So, for example, for the city of Cincinnati, which has school districts in northern Kentucky, in Ohio, and in Indiana, those states for the first time can see what's going on with the people who are going through the education system. So it's a massive potential to change. You can also rethink the organization. So in essence, the federal statistical system was set up as a public utility. And it has all the great features of a public utility and all the negative features of a public utility. So I'm an economist. Go and think about how Lynn Ostrom thought about how things might be organized. And the advantage of setting up an organization which is she makes the one point, self-determination of the community recognized by higher level authorities, thinking about building an environment in which people at the local level identify what measures and what data are important, and they're the ones who who identify what's of value. But there is some a federated system, if you like, of coordination and benchmarking. One of the examples that we have of that is the National Weather Service. So I like to tell the story. Back in 1900, the numbers on weather and the forecast came from Washington, D.C. And the problem was when a big storm was hitting, Washington said, that storm is hitting Florida. Well, it actually hit Texas, and 6,000 Americans died in Galveston because they didn't have the data, they didn't have the information. After that cataclysm, they reorganized so that the data collection was at weather stations throughout the country. National Weather Service provides a benchmarking and consistency checks, but the data are collected. So analogously, the National Weather Service does not produce one temperature for the United States. You have temperatures at all the local areas, and you could imagine doing the same thing for unemployment. You don't produce one unemployment number. It's not particularly meaningful unless you're the Federal Reserve, but for local people, they want to know what's it look like right now. So the way in which I would think about doing this, and the recommendation that I talk about in the book, is we have vehicles to do this. We have national labs, federally funded research and development centers, which provide the same functionality as a federal statistical system, but it has the advantage of being outside the pay scale, and they can get shut down. So they're not permanently embedded, and they are charged with innovation. And in fact, Nick Hart, who was largely a driver in creating the Evidence-Based Policy Foundations Act, and Nancy Potok, who was my boss at OMB and also at Census, and she was the chief statistician. When they came out with their report a couple of months ago, that's what they recommend. They cite my book, thank goodness. The other thing we need to do is to build the capacity to use the data. So the other reason to have a federal statistical system, and it's still true, highly trained, highly qualified and dedicated statisticians and survey methodologists. So they're great at doing surveys, dealing with these new types of data and thinking through it is new to them. And that's part of the reason we were asked to come in and develop training programs, and that's why we wrote the book. And I think part of what we can be thinking about is also a network system of building capacity. So think about the Ag Extension Program. We had the same problem in the late 1900s. And one of the reasons why American productivity grew so quickly was the establishment of the Morrill Act and the idea that you had researchers in universities, you had farmers who had questions, and you built the interaction. Farmers knew what the problems were, researchers in universities could work on those problems, and there was the interaction between each with the Ag Extension Program. And I think we could do the same here. There's fascinating and important questions that government can address at state, local, and federal levels. They are the ones, as I keep saying, at the coalface. They know their data, and we can combine the research community with the public data infrastructure to build new measures and ideas. Just routinize the Simon Kuznets coming in and figuring out GDP, but work it through at all levels of the country. So how are we going to do that? Well, you can engage with the states. I talked about the challenges with unemployment, and a set of states have been partnering with us to build this unemployment to reemployment dashboard using those UI claim data, tying it to training providers and then to the reemployment. So they're building the questions and building the answers. You can work with administrative agencies like HHS, which is trying to figure out how do we get standardized measures to look at welfare recipiency and transition to self-sufficiency. And then, of course, with researchers, and this is the last piece, you want to build a community around research data that's not a series of one-offs. You want to build a set of collaborative tools. So the last piece is connecting researchers who are working on different problems. And what we refer to that as is building an Amazon.com for data, so that rather than having researchers being isolated, effectively you can figure out what researchers are working on which data sets by machine reading empirical publications and finding out what data sets have been are cited in the publication from the semantic context whereby they're using it. We've been doing that with the agricultural, with USDA Economic Research Service. These are some data that you could generate just from reading a small subset of publications, creating a data scorecard around the Agricultural Resource Management Survey. So that was a lot to throw at you. I want to stop and give you enough time to talk. So I told you what I was going to tell you, then I told you, and I'm going to close out with saying it. So I do think we've got challenges. I think it's urgent that we act because the system's crumbling. We're producing data that are of less and less interest. It's being stymied it's evident because of the lack of funding. It's evident because of the lack of innovation. We've got a huge opportunity to change the way in which we do business because of technology and because massive numbers of data scientists. So let's rethink how we do it. And we're going to do it in 3 ways. Rethink the organizational structure through FFRDCs, rethink the training through an equivalent of an ag extension service where the public universities in each state and the think tanks engage with state agencies, and use AI tools to engage researchers to communicate with each other. And so I'd love to get any comments that you have, and those are some of the references for you. So Daniel, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Well, thank you so much for that introduction. And the book has so many detailed examples in some of these areas. So you managed to cover so much in 30 minutes is quite impressive. I'm not quite sure how to turn the sharing off. Can you do it for me, or? Yes, the sharing's off.
Oh, so, good. Thank you.
It's just the 2 of us now.
Good.
So as I mentioned at the outset, we want this to be an interactive question. I already do see some questions coming in. Please, again, if you have questions, you can submit them on Slido. If you're watching on our website, there's a link at the bottom of the page. If you're watching on YouTube, under the video description, there's a link, and you can just type those questions in there, and I'll be asking some of them. To start off, though, I want to ask a few questions about the idea of modernizing the federal statistical agencies and what that can look like, and some of the different proposals you have in there. One question I had based on the book was, how does the IT modernization efforts go hand in hand with the data modernization efforts? One of the reports that GAO came out with in the past few years was looking at how many IT systems were over 30 years, over 40 years, some were even over 50 years old. They're still programmed using COBOL or Fortran. I think there were 70 different outdated languages they identified in some of these systems. And obviously some of these, not all of these are statistical systems, but some of them are. We saw this, for example, with the unemployment state-based systems where this similar problem came up. As there are maybe there's sometimes more political will for IT modernization. It seems a little sexier, I think, than data modernization to some people. Is there a way to link those two together, or how should we be thinking about the technology platform on which the data platform runs?
It's a great question. So I believe we're seeing a sea change in that as well. So part of the challenge has been that when we talked about IT systems, mentally everyone thought about big physical servers, and there was a lot of money in that, right? The movement to the cloud represents a massive new opportunity, right? So because you can be in GovCloud and have actually a much more secure environment than a physical server, it's cheaper, you can update things faster, you can use open source tools like Python and R rather than large scale enterprise systems, or in addition to large scale enterprise systems. So the sea change, I think, that is happening is the importance of IT is of physical IT and service is diminishing, and the value proposition is coming in from the data. And you can see that in the Evidence Act. They've got the Council of Chief Data Officers. There are 24 of those imposed. So if those chief data officers can show the big wins of using data to allocate resources, you'll see much more interest in data as being sexy rather than investing in IT.
Yep. One of the questions that's come in from our audience is, where do you fall on one U.S. statistical agency, like in other countries in the world? I'm concerned about privacy sharing across agencies and funding for popular programs.
Sorry,
So the central part of the question was, where do you fall in the question of having one U.S. statistical agency as opposed to the 13 plus?
Yeah, so that's, I think I'm an economist, so I'm actually not a fan of monopoly power. So what I think is important is to build kind of a public utility like what I'm talking about with an FFRDC. I think the consistency of data is important, and that is a role for a federal statistical system, but there's no reason to have that in one monolithic agency.
Mm-hmm. One of the issues that has been top of mind for many people, of course, over the last summer especially, has been the issue of racial equality and racial justice. So taking this in a little bit different of a direction, but how equipped is the national statistical system to deal with these new types of challenges, and what role should it play in being part of that conversation?
So that goes right back to the trade-off with privacy. So one of the problems that you run into when you're trying to protect privacy is you can't release small cells, right? So if there are very few people who are in a particular local area, or there are anomalous situations, or there are very few people at the top end, for example, of the income distribution, you don't pick that up. So to some extent, our inability to describe what's happening to minorities in particular areas has exacerbated or worsened our understanding of the problem. That's why it's so important to be able to have access to the underlying data through a secure environment so that you can actually look at small cells to find out where problems are arising.
Thank you. If I can ask a follow-up question on that one. One of the critiques that I've seen of taking a data-driven approach to addressing questions of racial equity is that, some people would say, for example, if we're seeing low-income neighborhoods, minority neighborhoods with poor performance academically, a common solution that's proposed is we need to go in and collect more data to understand exactly what's happening there. And the critique that is being levied in some quarters is that, well, we know what's happening there. There's been years of systemic injustice, and do we risk, turning more attention to collecting data that maybe isn't measuring the inherent problems in society that are leading to these issues? And so I guess my question is, how do we balance those tensions of really smart and capable data analysis that can inform new policy interventions that can help understand what's working, what's not working, with also these bigger structural questions that can sometimes get missed because you're focusing on maybe too small of an issue or missing some of the broader societal effects? How do we integrate those two ideas?
Well, so I think that's a great question, but that's the point of engaging the community and identifying what measures ought to be used and what data ought to be used. So as we've been working with state and local agencies, and they're coming up with questions like, what are the effects of, I don't have a particular example on local communities, but I do, for example, on financial barriers to education for minorities, and particularly the ones who are acquiring STEM skills. The sample sizes are too small to get analyzed using traditional methods. But then what happens is, if you get people in through the training classes, for example, and they are the ones who are defining what the questions are, then they come up with different measures and and suggest new data sets that can be brought in to the secure environment. So in other words, the measures and the data and the questions aren't determined in Washington. How to measure, how to define the question, how to formulate the question, and how to figure out what the data sets are described at the local level. It's like the Galveston example. I want to be able to figure out what is happening in my local area. I'm the best one to know what data sets are going to be made available. Now, the problem is you do still want some external benchmarking to make sure that your numbers make sense and are consistent. And I think that's certainly a role for a national benchmarking institution. But driving the questions, driving the data, figuring out how things should be measured, that should largely be driven by the people who are experiencing and who really understand the questions that need to be asked.
We have an audience question I think picks up on that point. Maybe you can expand on it. The question is, it begins with a statement. Stat owners think they are the ones to formulate the questions to be asked. How do we get statistical agencies to include questions from outside their agency?
Again, that's exactly my point, right? So what tends to happen is, and for all the best reasons, so Janet Norwood describes how the current system came to be. The reason the United States system is broken up into 13 major principal statistical agencies and then about 100 smaller ones is the design was to be closer to their community. So that's why you have a Bureau of Transportation Statistics, Bureau of Labor Statistics, a Bureau of Justice Statistics. The whole idea there was to be closer to their community. And they do try really hard. They have advisory committees, they have National Academy studies and so on. But, clearly, if the data that they were producing, or in my mind, clearly, if the data that they were producing had huge value and we were able to describe the value, there would be a much bigger constituency that was pressuring their agencies and their Congress to produce it. But instead, what's happening is we've got the CDC example. The data that are produced by the CDC are not what people want to know. So they're turning to the private sector. And there are many, many examples of that. When I want to figure out how to get from point A to point B, I don't go to the Bureau of Transportation Statistics, right? I go to a private sector solution. So you're seeing this erosion of the value that the statistical agencies are producing because they're not close enough to their communities, even though they were designed to be so. But we have new technologies that enable us to be much closer to the communities, answering and innovating and answering questions that people actually care about.
So I want to ask you a question about that, because one of the tensions I see when I talk to people who are, at statistical agencies or working with them, is that there isn't always agreement on what their role should be. Because I think there's two kind of models of how you can run a statistical agency, or especially the public output of it, right? And so I contrast this with either being a library or a museum. A library is focused on archiving data and providing access to information in a fairly neutral manner. No one's neutral, but a somewhat neutral manner. A museum is similarly focused on preserving information and artifacts, but they're also really focused on interpreting that information and educating the community. And so, you have these two models, one where a statistical agency could be a pure neutral data provider, a data service, and then another where it has more of a role of doing data visualizations, interpreting the information. But then there's always questions about its independence, what its goals are with these interpretations. There's concerns about bias or what that might look like. And so my question is, do you have an opinion on which role agents should be focused on? Should they be doing one? Should they be doing both? And how do we strike that balance? Because I think that gets to that question of also who consumers are turning to for information. Are they turning to government for the interpretation, or are they turning to them for the data that's being supplied to somebody else for the interpretation?
Well, I really like what the Bureau of Labor Statistics, their mantra is, the glass isn't half full, it's not half empty, it's 4 ounces is an 8-ounce glass, right? So I think at the end of the day, what the statistical agencies are extraordinarily good at is putting out high quality information and then let others do the interpretation. There's a whole kind of ecosystem around statistical data, as you well know. I am going to say that the challenge, I think your example of a library and a museum is a good one. When you think about those, largely you think of things that are a little bit old and a little bit out of date. And I think the challenge that the statistical system has in terms of innovation is they're so focused on making sure it's exactly 4 ounces that I could die of thirst before you got the water to me, right? And so we ought to think about innovation in terms of maybe getting the perfect answer that's 2 years old is not the way of going about it. Maybe what I want to know today is to go on and find out, how many cases of COVID have there been yesterday? Because I'm worried about my risk of getting COVID today. Or what's the unemployment rate or economic activity in my local area now? Because I'm trying to figure out where to go and look for a job or where to open my business. Waiting a month or 2 months or a year to get that information isn't going to do me any good. So if you think about why the private sector is being successful, and I think we should be looking at that as a model, obviously not the only thing, but getting data quickly, maybe not perfect, but being able to get some sense of the range of error to the public so they can make decisions in a timely way is an important one. That doesn't, and maybe you just have the federal statistical agencies being kind of the museums, and you rely on the FFRDCs to give you more timely, quick, and more benchmarked information, but they're dedicated to providing information for the public good as well.
Yeah, it amazes me the delays that we see in some of the delivery of certain data. I remember there was some agricultural data I was waiting on for a survey that had been done a couple of years before, and tracking down name after name of who was supposed to be responsible, and I finally got the manager in charge who finally let me know the survey had in fact been done when it was supposed to have been done 2 years earlier, but they had an empty position, and until they filled that position, which had been open for 6 to 8 months, the data was sitting in some computer, and no one was even working on putting it out there for some time, which raised the question of millions of dollars were probably spent collecting the data, and at this point, at some point, it was going to become almost worthless because it was so out of date.
That's right.
And as you mentioned, the problems that government faces, of course, are across the board in terms of bureaucracy and slowness. And so that comes to another question that I see has come in on the from the audience. Are statistical agencies sufficiently funded? What needs to change in that space?
We've heard that complaint that they're not funded enough. I disagree. I think the example that one of my colleagues said 20 years ago when he was at the Bureau of Labor Statistics, I'm not going to name him because I don't want to get him in trouble, but he said the best thing that ever happened to the statistical system was when Ronald Reagan cut the budgets by 30%, because it forced them to change. If you keep funding them to do the same thing, guess what? They're going to keep doing the same thing. So forcing change, which is what happens in the private sector, if you're not producing something that has value, you go out of business. And I think forcing agencies to rethink the way in which they're collecting data is got to happen. And I don't think it's going to come organically. So creating this parallel set of activities is, I think, the best way to effect change.
Mm-hmm. So when you talk about the National Lab for Community Data proposal and having this kind of bottom-up approach, how are you seeing resolution in terms of getting uniformity and dealing with those challenges of federalism that we see in so many areas? I know we spent some time looking at the prescription drug monitoring program recently, and it's something that was mandated at the federal level and all 50 states implemented it. But then the central question of, could you actually extract from these 50 programs meaningful data about where opioid addiction was occurring and abuse was occurring in prescribing patterns? It became impossible because of the simple fact that even though it was a federally funded program and even though it was developed at the state level to address local needs, there was still this disconnect of how do we all work together? How do we overcome that barrier?
Well, obviously I thought about that a lot when I was asked to produce the secure data environment, the administrative data research facility, to inform the decision making of the commission. So people think that the answer is just put the data in one place and everything's going to be fine. But in fact, as you're just pointing out, the challenge is that until you're together and working on the same data from different states, all of these decisions are made in the abstract. And one of the problems that tends to happen at the federal level is people make up measures without really understanding the data and push those measures down to the states, and they make no sense. What we've been doing with the training classes is getting people from different states, and HHS has played a really important role here, Agency for Children and Families and Office of Policy and Research Evaluation, OPRI. So what they've done is they have funded a set of classes where they brought together state data practitioners who work on TANF data and tie it to workforce data. And guess what? When you have people working on the same data from 8 different states, and they're trying to get up simple measures like exit from TANF, movement to self-sufficiency, and they're actually faced with the data not in the abstract, but they've got to come up with measures, a conversation takes place because they're all working, and that's how the measures are getting developed, and they are jointly developing common measures and metrics, not from top down, but from bottom up. And that's what happened when we built the LEHT program. The states came together. They wanted to build common measures of employment dynamics, and they ended up building a common data model, but it was question-driven, not process-driven. And that's what I've been trying to say is start with the questions, and the data model and the measures will follow. You don't start with a model and the measures and then produce the output. You've got to start from the questions and then everything flows back. And that is the role for the federal government.
We've had a few questions come in asking about the funding models for creating data through the public sector, and concerns that either it's not sustainable or that the comparisons with the private sector might be a challenge, because in the private sector, these companies are successfully monetizing the data, and the government's not monetizing the data in the same way. So how do we kind of balance that in the sense that no one likes to look at something and say, oh, this is just a cost center? You talked a little bit before, certainly in the book and your presentation too, about better understanding the value here to make that case. But is there anything else that we need to do to make this sustainable?
Yeah, so sustainability obviously sits at the core. And that goes back to my earlier point. Obviously, I'm not originally an American. I married a Yankee, but it happens to the best of us. That was a joke, guys. The great thing about the US system is you don't have a set of mandarins who make decisions and it pushes down on high. You have something called Congress. And so when I built the LEHD program, and I talk about this in the book, what was very clear is that the state agencies, they were very driven by their clients. Their clients largely were the workforce boards and the employment training providers. And the reason that they were so important was they talked to the state legislatures and the federal legislatures. So what happened was they were the ones that developed the measures that are still in place for the LEHD program today. And they're the ones who understood, so that why would anyone want to use those measures? And then what happened? Those constituencies talked to their congressional representatives, and that's what caused line funding. That's what created that. And this model for the FFRDCs as well.
So we're almost at time. I want to ask one last question that I think has been in the policy debate over the last few years. And that's the question of the trust in public data. How do we safeguard against attempts to politicize statistical agencies? How do we improve and restore trust in various agencies where I think it's diminished, has been diminished for some time, and particularly in these really valuable data sets like the census, like the data that's produced by the CDC? What needs to be done to kind of institutionalize that process to make sure that as we go forward, in policy debates, it's just so critical, I think, that everyone is working from the same facts, because that's how we get to compromise, and that's how we get to agreements. And the concern, I think, for people who are interested in democratic governance is that if we can't get to a common agreement on facts, if the data isn't something that everyone trusts, that really undercuts the ability to make effective policy and to have reasonable policy debates. So I know that's something you've obviously thought a lot about. I was just wondering if you could close on that with some final remarks from you.
I think obviously that's critical. I think that having a small group of people, and that's the challenge with monopoly power, if you don't know how the data are generated, and I again talk about that in the book, and it's kind of a black box, it's very difficult to have trust for all the reasons that we're seeing now. Building a community of practice around the data where there's replicability and reusability of data not only lowers the cost, but it increases confidence, particularly when it comes from multiple sources. A little bit like the National Weather Service with the temperature in the local area.
Well, great. Well, thank you again so much, Professor Lane, for being here today, for sharing your thoughts. I encourage everyone watching to go out and get the book. As I said, there's so much more in there that we weren't able to cover. But really appreciate your time today and sharing your thoughts. This is an important conversation, one that I'm hopeful, after the election, when people start going back to the business of doing government, this is something that will get more and more attention and will continue to grow. The last thing I'll just mention is that, as I said at the beginning, this book talk is the inaugural session of what will be a series of book talks on a variety of issues related to data-driven innovation, data in government, and AI. Our next talk is scheduled for November 13th, It's with Ryan Abbott on his new book, The Reasonable Robot, Artificial Intelligence and the Law. I encourage you to sign up for that one and look forward to some of our future conversations. So thank you for joining us today. Thank you again, Julia.
Thank you so much, Daniel.